The words came through the study door before Verity was meant to hear them at all, and they were these: "Have the widow pour in her place." She stood in the passage with a basket of cut chamomile against her hip, the stems still damp from the physic garden, and she did not move, and did not breathe any louder than she had to, because a year of being overlooked in this house had taught her that stillness was its own kind of hearing. She was 25, the Duchess of Rathmore by a bargain rather than a courtship, and she had learned early that a woman who wishes to know a house must first learn to be furniture in it. She did not yet know what those 6 words would cost her before the year was out. Had she known, she would have set down the basket and walked in and demanded her answer on the spot, and she would have been wrong to do it, though it would be many weeks before she understood why. Behind the door, her husband's voice went on, low and even, the voice of a man giving an order he did not enjoy giving. 11 days, he said. Not a morning more. She heard the chair complain as someone rose, heard the small, definite click of a lockbox, and then footsteps coming for the door, and she was 3 strides down the passage with the basket swinging as though nothing at all had happened before the latch turned behind her. Gideon Vane, 5th Duke of Rathmore, had married her the year before in a ceremony so quiet that half the county still did not credit it, and he had done it, he had told her plainly, on the only evening they had ever spoken of it, honestly. Because his father's settlement required a wife within the 12-month of his inheriting, or the whole estate reverted sideways to his late brother's line, and because he had looked about him and found, in her, a woman who did not want to be loved so much as she wanted to be left alone to do useful work. It had seemed at the time a fair exchange. She had needed a roof and a purpose more than she had needed romance, her father's apothecary shop having gone the way of his debts within a season of his dying, and she had brought to Rathmore nothing but a small trunk, a steady pair of hands, and her mother's still-room book, its spine cracked from 30 years of use, its margins crowded with her mother's small, definite handwriting. She had made herself useful within a month. She kept the physic garden, dosed the tenants' fevers, balanced the household's medicinal accounts to the farthing, and asked her husband for nothing beyond the courtesy he had promised her, which he gave, correctly, and without warmth, the way a man pays a debt he respects but does not feel. She told herself this was enough. She had built her whole life on not being seen, and she was not now going to unmake that skill over 6 overheard words and a closed door. In 11 days, the house would keep the first anniversary of their marriage, and she knew, because she had read the settlement herself in the muniment room one wet afternoon when there was nothing else to do, exactly what hung upon that date. If she lived to see the year out as his wife, the entail ran clean and unchallengeable to Gideon's issue forever after. If she did not, if the marriage ended, by whatever means, before the anniversary struck midnight, the whole of the principal estate reverted to the line of Gideon's dead brother, to his widow's son, a boy of 10 named Alden, who had already lost one father and, Verity privately thought, deserved better than to be made the hinge of anyone's ambition. She had never feared the claws. She feared very little in the ordinary way. Fear was a luxury for women who had not already lost everything once and learned to go on regardless. But a widow, pouring wine in her place, at the very feast that sealed her year, that she could not immediately account for, and the not accounting for it sat in her chest like a stone dropped into a well, sending up no sound at all. Only rings. She carried the chamomile to the still room and set it down and squared the basket's corners against the table's edge, a small, precise motion that steadied her hands whenever her mind would not be steadied, and she told the empty room, in her mother's voice more than her own, that a poison is only ever a kindness aimed wrong, and that the trick of any trouble was to learn its name before it learned yours. She did not yet know she was about to need that maxim in an entirely literal sense. She only knew that somewhere beyond that door, her husband had made a decision that touched her most nearly, and had not troubled to let her hear it from anyone but the wrong side of a door, and that stung worse. If she was honest with the still room's empty air, then any humiliation the widow herself might bring. She did not raise the matter with him that night, nor the next, though she watched him with the close attention she gave to a fever she did not yet trust to break. Gideon Vane was not a man who wasted movement. He was tall in the way that made low doorways a small daily indignity, and he sat a horse and a supper table with the same economical stillness, and the county had decided, in the year since his father's death, that he was cold because he did not perform his feelings for an audience the way his father had. Verity had come to suspect, watching him across a year of correct suppers, that he was not cold so much as he was a man carrying a weight he had decided, alone, that no one else was strong enough to help him lift, which was its own kind of arrogance dressed as kindness. She found him in the estate office 2 evenings later, ledgers open before him in the candlelight, and she came in on the pretext of the quarter's medicine accounts, which was true enough not to be a lie. "I hear we are to have a guest pour the anniversary wine," she said, and kept her voice as level as his own ever was. He did not look up at once, which told her more than his face would have. "A widow of my acquaintance," he said. "Mrs. Locke. She has some skill in these matters, and I have asked her assistance." "Some skill in pouring wine, my lord?" she asked, and he set down his pen with the particular care of a man setting down something he would rather have thrown. "It is done, Verity," he said. "I would rather you were angry with me than endangered by me, and I find those are, at present, the only 2 doors on offer." She did not know what to make of a sentence like that, coming from a man who rationed sentences the way other men rationed coin, and she filed it away the way she filed away everything she did not yet understand. In the same drawer of her mind where she kept her mother's recipes, to be taken out later and read again in better light. Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, found her afterward sitting very straight in the still room, doing nothing at all, which was so unlike her that the older woman set down her candle and said, without preamble, "Well, and which of them has offended you worse, him or his guest?" "Neither," said Verity. "Both. I cannot tell which." Mrs. Pruitt had kept house at Rathmore since before Gideon could walk, and she had exactly one register of speech, which was blunt, and exactly one loyalty, which was to whoever was doing the actual work of the house, a category that had never once in 30 years included a duke. "Men," she said, settling into the second chair as though she had been invited, "will move heaven and the home farm to spare a woman a hurt, and never once think to spare her the hurt of not knowing why. It is their besetting stupidity. I have buried 2 husbands and outlived a great deal of their good intentions." Verity almost laughed, which was the first true loosening in her chest in 2 days, and said that she supposed there was some comfort in being stupidly protected rather than not protected at all. "There is some comfort in most things," said Mrs. Pruitt, "if you hold them up to enough light, though I have never yet found the comfort in a cold supper, and this still room will smell of chamomile until Michaelmas if you leave that basket where it is." She rose and paused at the door and said, more gently than her habit, that whatever his lordship was about, he had not slept a full night since the dog died, and that a man who loses sleep over a decision is not, in her long experience, a man planning cruelty. It was the first Verity had heard of any dog, and she asked, and Mrs. Pruitt's face did the thing faces do when they have said one word more than they meant to, and she said only, "Ask his lordship," and was gone before Verity could press her, leaving the chamomile and the question. And the 11 days, now 9, ticking down together in the quiet room. She did not ask him. She told herself this was patience, and it was, in part, though it was also pride, the particular pride of a woman who had spent her whole life proving she did not need to be told things twice, or told them at all, in order to work them out for herself. She began, instead, to watch the household the way she watched a fever chart, for the small signs that told a larger truth. She learned from the stable boy that a dog had indeed died in the spring, one of the deerhound bitches, found stiff by the west gate, with froth dried at her mouth, and that his lordship himself had gone out at dawn to see the body before anyone else was let near it, and had said nothing to anyone after, only ordered the west cellar locked and its key moved to his own chain. She learned from the wine steward's grumbling that the cellar's best decanter, the one kept for the Duchess's private table and marked with her initials worked in silver at the neck, had been sent away to be regilded some weeks past, and had not yet returned, though the silversmith swore he had never received it. She learned from nobody at all, only from her own eyes, that Lady Rosalind Vane, her husband's brother's widow, who had lived at Rathmore since her own husband's death, and who moved through its rooms with the soft, immaculate grace of a woman who had never once in her life had to raise her voice to be obeyed, had taken, in these last weeks, to visiting the still room when she thought it empty, and to asking the underservants, in her gentlest tones, whether the Duchess kept a close accounting of what she dispensed, and to whom. Verity was not, by nature, a suspicious woman. She had spent a year being grateful for a roof and a husband who did not raise his voice, and gratitude, she was beginning to learn, could make a person slow to see what was standing directly in front of her. But she was, by training, an apothecary's daughter, and an apothecary's daughter learns before she learns her letters that nothing in a still room moves by accident, and that when a wine cup goes missing and a dog dies frothing and a woman with soft hands starts asking after the dosage ledgers, those are not 3 separate weathers, but one storm, gathering. And that a storm gathers longest just before the day it is due to break. The bargain that had made her a duchess had been struck, in point of fact, on a February evening 11 months before this one, in the same estate office where she had lately failed to get a straight answer out of her husband, and she found herself turning the memory over now the way she turned over a difficult prescription, looking for what she had missed the first time through. Gideon had come to her father's old lodgings, where she still kept 2 rooms and a great deal of unpaid grief, with a proposal so plainly stated it had taken her a full minute to understand he meant it as a kindness. "I require a wife within the year or my father's estate goes to my brother's boy," he had said, "and my brother's widow is, I think, unfit to hold it in trust, though I could not prove that to a court if my life depended on it, which in a manner of speaking it does. I do not ask you to love me. I ask only that you be capable and discreet and unafraid of me, which I am told is rarer in a wife than the other 2 put together." She had asked him because she had nothing left to lose by asking. Why her, out of all the women in the county who would have married a duke for considerably less honesty? "Because you asked me what the terms were before you asked me what the house looked like," he had said, "and because a woman who negotiates before she weeps is a woman I can trust to tell me the truth later, when it costs her something." She had not wept once in the year since, not even privately, and she wondered now, turning the old memory over in the candlelight of a house she still did not fully understand, whether that had been the very quality in her he had decided, alone and without consulting her, that he now needed to spend. The soft threat, when it came wrapped in concern, which Verity would later think was the truest description she ever found for Rosalind Vane in the whole of that autumn. It arrived on the 8th day, in the small parlor where the ladies of the house took their tea when the gentlemen were from home, and it arrived in a voice so gentle that a woman less trained in listening might have mistaken it for kindness clear through. "My dear Verity," Rosalind said, turning her cup a slow quarter turn upon its saucer, "you look tired. And I only wonder whether the still room does not tax you more than a woman in your position ought to bear alone." "I am very well," said Verity. "You keep such careful books," Rosalind went on, as though she had not spoken. "Every grain and every drop, I am told, set down to the scruple. It is a rare gift, though I confess I sometimes wonder whether so much handling of strong medicines does not wear upon the nerves, in time, without one's noticing." "My nerves are unremarkable," said Verity, and smiled, because a smile cost nothing and gave away less. Rosalind smiled back and touched, as she often did when a silence needed filling, the small dark mourning ring she still wore for her dead husband, 3 years buried now, a habit Verity had noted and filed away without yet understanding its weight. "Of course," Rosalind said. "Of course. It is only that Alden asked me only yesterday whether his uncle's wife would always live with us, and I did not know what to tell the child, and children, ask the questions grown people are too well bred to ask aloud." Verity set down her own cup with great care, corner of the saucer aligned to the table's edge, and said that she rather thought Alden's uncle's wife intended to go on living with them for a great many years yet, God and good health permitting, and Rosalind said, softly, smiling still, "Of course, my dear, of course," and the two women sat a moment longer in a silence that had, underneath its politeness, all the weight of a held breath, and Verity understood, without being able to say precisely how, that she had just been threatened by a woman who would go to her grave denying she had ever raised her voice. The county, meanwhile, had begun to talk, as counties will, about the widow who was to pour the Rathmore anniversary wine, and the talk reached Verity second-hand, through Mrs. Pruitt's disapproving mouth and the underservant's badly hidden glances, and it did her no kindness. A groom's wife at the home farm had wagered a shilling with the smith's daughter over whether her ladyship would attend the feast at all, and Verity, hearing of the wager from Mrs. Pruitt, who reported it with the particular relish of a woman delivering bad news she considers entirely someone else's fault, said only that she hoped the smith's daughter had bet on the side of her attending, since she did not intend to give the county the satisfaction of an empty chair. "Good girl," said Mrs. Pruitt, and then, because 30 years of service had earned her the right to say what no one else in the house dared, added that if his lordship did not mend his manner of explaining himself soon, she would take a broom to him herself, duke or no duke. And Verity laughed for the second time in a week, a short surprised sound that felt, in her own chest, like something thawing. It was in the still room 2 mornings later, counting the quarter's dispensary against her mother's ledger by habit before breakfast, that she found the thing that turned her private unease into something closer to dread. The tally would not balance. 4 ounces of wolfsbane tincture, kept always under lock for the rats in the granary and for nothing else, entered in her own hand at midsummer as 4 ounces received, showed now as only 1 remaining, with no record in her own writing of the other 3 ever having left the shelf. She checked the lock. It was unforced. She checked her own memory, which she trusted the way she trusted little else in that house, and her memory was certain she had dispensed none of it, to no one, for any purpose in all the months since midsummer. Someone had taken 3 ounces of a poison strong enough to still a grown deerhound within the hour, from a locked room, without leaving a mark upon the lock or a line upon the page, and had left behind only a silence exactly the shape of her own missing certainty. The full weight of what had been done to her did not arrive all at once, the way a blow arrives, but gathered slowly, the way water gathers behind a dam that has not yet been noticed to be cracked, and it arrived complete on the morning Mrs. Pruitt came to her white about the mouth with a folded paper in her hand, and said that the county apothecary's boy had brought it up from the village, addressed to his lordship, and that she had thought, given everything, her grace ought to see it first. It was a receipt, in a clerk's careful copying hand, for 4 ounces of tincture of wolfsbane. Sold 9 weeks past to the Duchess of Rathmore's own order, and signed, at the foot, with a signature that was very nearly Verity's own, close enough to deceive a busy clerk who had never troubled to compare it against anything, wrong enough, to an apothecary's daughter who had signed her own name 10,000 times in the slant of the final downstroke, which her true hand never gave. She sat with the paper a long while in the still room's gray morning light, and did not weep, because weeping had never once solved anything in her whole practical life, and thought instead, with the cold clarity she brought to any difficult diagnosis, that whoever had done this had understood her exactly, had known that her competence was the one thing in this house entirely her own, the one inheritance her mother had left her that no settlement or entail could touch, and had taken that very gift and turned its edge back against her throat. It was, she thought, holding the false receipt up to the light the way her mother had taught her to hold a tincture to check its clarity, a very particular cruelty, to be ruined not by a lie about one's character, but by a forgery of one's own hand. And she understood, with a certainty that settled into her chest like cold water finding its level, that whatever safety she had believed the still room gave her had been, all along, precisely the trap someone else had built to spring. She did not go to Gideon with the receipt at once, though every ordinary instinct told her a wife ought to go running to her husband with proof that she was being framed for poisoning his own hounds, and, she did not doubt, meant next for something worse. She had watched him, these 3 weeks, make one decision after another, without once inviting her into the room where the deciding happened, and something in her, some old stubborn root that had survived her father's ruin and her own quiet marrying, refused to be the only one in the house who asked permission before acting. She went instead to Rosalind's late husband's old steward, a cautious man named Sims, who had kept the West Cellar's keys since before Verity's marriage and who flinched when she asked him plainly whether the missing decanter had truly gone to the silversmith, in a manner no honest man flinches at an honest question. She said nothing further to him that morning, only watched him go pale and busy himself unnecessarily with a ledger that did not need his attention, and she thought, walking back through the long gallery with the false receipt folded inside her bodice like a second heartbeat, that a man who startles at a simple question is a man who knows precisely which of 2 doors the truth is hiding behind and needs only the right pressure, applied once, cleanly, before witnesses, to open it. She was still turning that thought over when the messenger came up the drive at a hard trot 2 evenings later, mud to the horse's hocks, with a letter for his lordship sealed in wax she did not recognize, and Gideon, reading it in the hall by the light of a single branch of candles, went the particular still color of a man receiving news he had been dreading and expecting in equal measure, and folded the letter once and looked up and found her watching him from the stair, and for the length of one held breath neither of them said anything at all. And Verity thought, watching his face do the thing it did when he was working very hard not to let it do anything, that whatever answer she had been waiting 9 days for was standing now on the other side of that folded paper, and that she had, at last, run entirely out of patience to wait for him to hand it to her. He did not hand it to her that night or the next, and she understood, watching the household draw its silent battle lines around the coming feast, that the 2 of them had somehow become generals fighting the same unnamed war from opposite ends of the same table, each convinced the other must not be told the whole of the field for fear of what the telling would cost. She spent those last days doing what she had always done in trouble. She worked. She went back through her mother's still-room book, page by page, the way she had not troubled to do since her father died, searching for anything her mother's own hand might have set down about wolfsbane and its signs and its cures, and found, tucked between 2 pages devoted to a recipe for cough syrup, a single loose leaf she did not remember ever having seen before, in a hand that was not her mother's at all. A receipt for tincture of wolfsbane purchased some months back for, the leaf said plainly, the rats in the home farm granary, and signed, unmistakably, in Rosalind Vane's own careful, immaculate hand. She sat very still over that small piece of paper for a long time, the still room's late light moving slow across the floor. A linnet singing on and on outside the window, as though the world had not just rearranged itself entirely around her, and she thought, with something that was not yet triumph and not yet grief, but some cold, clean thing that lived in the country between them, that she had at last learned the storm's true name, and that a name, once learned, could not be unlearned, whatever it cost the one who now carried it. The men who would gather in 3 days' time to drink the anniversary toast had no notion that the wine they raised would be the last act of a much older reckoning, and Verity, closing the book gently over its false page, the way one closes a door on a room not yet ready to be entered. Resolved that whatever her husband was planning behind his own locked doors, she would not walk into the last night of her first married year unarmed, and unknowing, and silent, ever again. The 2 remaining days passed the way the last hours before a storm always pass, too bright, too still, the whole house moving through its ordinary business with an unnatural care, as though everyone in it had begun, without quite admitting it to themselves, to listen for thunder. Gideon came to her on the 2nd evening, in the small hour after the household had gone to bed, and found her in the still room with her mother's book still open on the table, and stood a long moment in the doorway before he spoke, which was, for a man of his economy, itself a kind of confession. "Verity," he said, and stopped, and started again. "Whatever happens tomorrow night, I need you to trust that I have not stopped loving you enough to keep you safe, even where I have failed to keep you comfortable." She looked up at him, at the tiredness worn into his face like water into stone, and said, more gently than she had meant to, that a man might try trusting his wife with the truth before he asked her to trust him with the consequences of withholding it, and he crossed the room and took up her hand, not as a lover takes a hand, but as a man reaching for solid ground, and said that there was a thing he could not yet lay before her, only 1 night more, and that he would rather she hated him alive tomorrow morning than loved him and buried him tonight. She did not understand the sentence fully, not yet, though she would carry it whole and unbroken in her memory until the night it finally made sense, and she said only, very quietly, that she had found the false receipt, and the true one beneath it, and that whatever storm he thought he was weathering alone, she had already been standing in the rain of it for 3 weeks, and intended to be standing in it, dry-eyed and armed, when it finally broke. He looked at her then the way a man looks at ground he has just discovered, is not, after all, as unstable as he had feared, and said nothing further, only pressed her hand once, hard, and left her to her book and her small triumphant grief, and Verity sat a long while after he had gone, listening to the linnet's late song outside the window, and thought that whatever tomorrow brought, she would not meet it as a woman waiting to be rescued, but as one who had already, quietly, in a locked still room with a false receipt and a true one, begun to build her own case. The morning of the anniversary came in gold and windless. The kind of autumn morning her mother would have called wasted on grief, and the house filled by noon with carriages and cousins and the county's better families, all come to drink the health of a marriage half of them still privately doubted, and Verity dressed for it in her own best gray silk, refusing absolutely the maid's suggestion of anything gayer. Because she had decided, somewhere in the small hours, that she would meet whatever the evening held looking exactly like herself and no more. She saw Esther Locke for the first time at 4 o'clock, arriving alone in a plain hired chaise with no maid and a single black trunk, a tall, composed woman, perhaps 10 years Verity's senior, with an apothecary's steady hands and a widow's plain dark dress, and she watched Gideon greet her in the hall with a correctness so perfectly performed for the assembling guests that only a wife trained to read a face for a living would have caught the single flicker of relief that crossed his own at the sight of her. Relief, Verity noted with interest, and not one grain of the guilty warmth the county gossip had promised her. She did not yet understand what she was looking at. She only understood, watching the two of them exchange 4 low words no one else in the hall was near enough to hear, that whatever this Mrs. Locke was to her husband, it was not what the smith's daughter had wagered her shilling on, and she filed the observation away with everything else she had gathered these 3 weeks, and went into dinner with her spine straight, and her face composed, and her mother's small loose page folded, once more, against her heart. The great hall at Rathmore had been dressed for the feast with more candles than Verity had ever seen burning in it at once, and the long table ran the length of the room twice over, with the county's best families seated by rank on either side, and Rosalind sat near the head in dark green silk with her mourning ring catching the light each time she lifted her glass. And Alden sat beside her looking, as 10-year-old boys will at grand occasions, both proud and faintly seasick with the honor of it, and Verity took her own place at her husband's right hand and thought, looking down that gauntlet of candlelight and expectant faces, that she had never in her life felt so watched and so alone at once. It was Sir Anthony Cole, the county's magistrate, seated near the middle of the table in his sober blue coat, who first proposed the toast, rising with his glass already half lifted and calling for the wine to be poured for the health of the Duke and Duchess of Rathmore on the completion of their first married year, and it was into that exact silence, with every glass in the room still empty and every eye already turning toward the Duchess's chair in ordinary expectation of seeing her own hand lift the decanter as custom required, that Gideon rose instead and said, in a voice pitched to carry the whole length of that glittering table, that tonight Mrs. Locke would do the office of pouring, and that he begged his wife's indulgence. And the rooms in the matter. The silence that followed was not the silence of a held breath, but the silence of an entire company recalculating, all at once, everything they thought they had understood about the marriage they had come to celebrate, and Verity felt every eye at that table find her face in the space of a single held second, and she did not let it move, though inside her chest something old and proud and long-suffering screamed to be let out, because she alone at that table, of every soul present, had spent 3 weeks preparing for precisely this moment, and had come to it, at the last, armed. Esther Locke rose from her place at the table's far end, with the decanter already in her steady apothecary's hand, the same silver-worked decanter. Verity now saw with a small, cold shock of recognition that had gone missing to the silversmith's some weeks before, and had, apparently, never left the house at all, and she moved down the length of the table pouring for each guest in turn, with a composure that gave nothing at all away, until she came to the 2 glasses set at Rosalind Vane's place, her own and her son's, and there she stopped, and did not pour, and said, into a room already strung as tight as a bowstring, "Set down your glass, my lord bishop. It is not fit to drink," and reached instead into her bodice and drew out a small stoppered vial and held it up, not to Rosalind, but to the light, so that every guest at that long table could see the faint bitter cloudiness in wine that ought to have run clear. And the room did exactly what rooms full of frightened, well-bred people do when the ground shifts beneath a feast. Every hand at that table, without a single word spoken to command it, set its glass down upon the cloth, all along the table's length, in a soft chorus of small, definite sounds, like rain beginning. Rosalind Vane came to her feet with her composure only very slightly disturbed, her hand going, as it always did, to the small dark mourning ring at her finger, and said, in a voice still gentle, still immaculate, that she did not understand what game was being played at her expense at a feast meant to honor her own brother-in-law's marriage, and it was Verity, not Gideon, who rose next, her mother's still-room book already open in her two steady hands to the loose page she had found, tucked between a cough remedy and a fever draught, and said, in a voice that did not shake because she had spent 3 weeks learning not to let it, that she had found, in her own locked still-room, a false receipt bearing a forgery of her own signature for 4 ounces of wolfsbane tincture she had never purchased, and beside it, in her own mother's book, the true receipt, in the true hand of the woman who had actually bought it, for the rats in the granary, she read aloud, and looked up, and let the silence finish the sentence for her. Sir Anthony Cole set down his own glass with the particular, deliberate care of a magistrate whose evening has just become his business, and asked, in the plain, unhurried voice of a man who has asked such questions all his working life, whether anyone at this table could account for how a decanter reported, sent to a silversmith some weeks past, had come to be standing on it tonight, and it was Sims, the steward, gone the color of tallow at the foot of the table, who broke first, his hands shaking so badly the platter before him rattled, and said, into a silence that had been waiting 3 weeks for exactly this confession, that her ladyship had told him only to set the good decanter by for the anniversary night and dose it fresh before the toast, and that he had thought, God forgive him, that it was only a cordial to sweeten it, and had truly not known, what else was in the bottle she had given him to add. Rosalind's composure did not break so much as it simply stopped being maintained, the way a held note stops when the singer has no more breath, and for one unguarded moment before she mastered her own face again, Verity saw, plain as a diagnosis, that the grief in it was entirely real, that this was a woman who had buried a husband and watched her son demoted from heir to afterthought in the space of one father's death and one brother's remarriage, and had let that grief calcify, slowly, into an arithmetic where her son's safety and another woman's death had somehow come to occupy the same column of the same ledger. Gideon read aloud, in a voice gone very quiet, the letter that had come by hard-ridden messenger 3 nights before, from the county's own coroner's office, confirming what Mrs. Locke's private inquiries these many weeks had already suggested, that the Rathmore deerhound bitch had died of wolfsbane, and that the same substance in a smaller and more patient dose had been found, upon careful testing these last days, in 3 separate bottles drawn from the Duchess's own private store across the summer past. Meant not for a single fatal night, but for a slow, unremarkable decline that no physician in the county would ever have thought to question until the anniversary itself, when a faster dose delivered at the very toast that sealed the entail would finish, in one convenient evening, what patience had not managed in time. It was Verity who spoke last into that ruin, setting her mother's book down gently upon the cloth, and saying that she did not ask for the law's full weight to fall on a woman who had done this thing for love of a frightened child rather than for love of cruelty itself, and that mercy, properly given, cost the giver more than punishment ever did, and was worth more for exactly that reason. Sir Anthony, weighing the room and the wine and the boy's stricken face all in the same long glance, pronounced that Lady Rosalind Vane would be removed that same week to a small dower house on the estate's far border, with an allowance sufficient for comfort and insufficient for scheming, and that her son would remain at Rathmore under his uncle's guardianship and inherit, in time, whatever honest portion the law and his uncle's generosity together saw fit to settle on him, and that no word of poison would ever leave that room to follow the boy through his life. And Rosalind, hearing her son's future spoken aloud and made safe in the very sentence that ruined her, put her hand once more to her mourning ring and wept, at last, honestly, for the first time since her husband died. It was very late, the guests long gone, the great hall stripped back to its ordinary candles, when Gideon found Verity alone in the still-room, her mother's book closed again before her, and said, without preamble, that he had known for 3 weeks that the poison was being aimed at her, and had brought Esther Locke to the house not as a mistress, but as the one apothecary in the county with skill. Enough to trace a slow dosing before it turned fatal, and had staged the insult of the pouring, God forgive him, because he had feared that if Rosalind ever suspected herself watched, she would abandon the slow poison for something faster and less traceable, and he had rather Verity hate him for 11 days than mourn her for the rest of his life. I would rather you safe and hating me, he said again, quieter now, than loved and in the ground, and Verity, closing her mother's book at last, said that she had spent those 11 days neither hating him nor entirely trusting him, but building, in her own locked room, with her own inherited skill, the very proof that had ended the evening, and that perhaps the lesson in all of it was not that he must choose between her safety and her trust, but that he had never actually needed to choose at all, if only he had thought to ask her to stand beside him instead of in front of her. He crossed the room and took her hand, and said that he did not ask her now to love him, only to marry him again, in her own heart, on terms she set herself. Because the year was ended, and the entail was safe, and there was nothing left standing between them but whatever she herself was willing to choose, and Verity, who had signed one bargain a year before out of need, and found herself now signing another entirely out of something she had not let herself name until this moment, said that she would take him. This time, for no reason at all but that she wished it, which was, she told him, the only reason worth taking, and he said that it was the only reason he would ever have accepted. The wedding they kept that winter, a quiet renewing of vows before the parish rector and a handful of the household who had earned the right to witness it, was smaller by a great margin than the feast that had nearly ended in poison, and Mrs. Pruitt wept openly through the whole of it, and told anyone who would listen afterward that she had said all along a man who loses sleep over a decision is not a man planning cruelty, and had been right, and intended to remind his lordship of it at every opportunity for the rest of her natural life. Sims, whose one honest confession before witnesses had undone Rosalind's whole design, kept his place at Rathmore by Gideon's own express mercy, on the condition, gently but firmly stated, that he never again accept a bottle from anyone without first asking what was in it. Esther Locke stayed on through the winter at Verity's own particular invitation, teaching her, in the long, quiet still-room afternoons, the finer arts of testing a suspect tincture, and left in the spring for the county town with a standing invitation to return whenever she liked, which she did, more than once, in the years that followed. Alden Vane grew up at Rathmore under his uncle's unhurried guardianship and grew, in time, into a young man who could not remember why the county had once whispered his mother's name, only that his aunt had asked, at the one table where his whole future was decided, that mercy be given rather than withheld, and he loved her for it all his life, without ever quite knowing the full shape of what she had spared him. Rosalind Vane lived out her years in the small dower house at the estate's far border, visited faithfully by her son, and wrote once a single letter to Verity before she died, thanking her, in words that cost her everything they contained, for having chosen a ledger with mercy in its final column, rather than the one she herself had kept so carefully all those years. It was very nearly a year later, on an evening gone gold and windless in exactly the same way, that Verity stood again in the passage outside the estate office with a basket of cut chamomile against her hip, and heard her husband's voice through the half-open door, not lowered this time, not hidden, saying to Sir Anthony Cole, who had come to dine, that his wife kept the finest still-room in the county, and he would match her judgment against any physician's in England, and she stood a moment in the doorway listening, the way she had stood a year before dreading what she might hear, and found instead that she was smiling, and pushed the door open the rest of the way herself. And Gideon looked up and lifted his glass to her before she had even crossed the threshold, and said, before the whole room, "Lift your glass, for once, to a truth I never again mean to keep from you." And the linnet outside the window sang on, unconcerned, exactly as it had the whole year through, and if this quiet story of a hurt that was never what it seemed. And a house that learned proof outlasts suspicion, and a mercy that cost the giver more than punishment ever could, has warmed some cold corner of your evening the way a well-tended hearth warms a cold room. Then stay a while longer by this fire, with me at Fireside in Folio, where the kettle is always on and a chair is always kept for you. And tell me, in the comments below, which moment made you set down your own glass alongside Verity's guests, the widow's warning, the false receipt, or the quiet ring a grieving woman could not stop touching, and if you have not yet done so, keep your place among us by subscribing so that the next story finds you when it comes. Sleep well tonight, and be gentle, as Verity finally was, with the ones who turn out to have been guarding your lamp all along.